Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my rest of season strength of schedule for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be covering the singular variable of matchups and how it particularly impacts a fantasy prospect's future success for the remainder of the 2022 season. Now, of course, we're going to be talking about the four primary fantasy positions: running back, wide receiver, tight end, and quarterback, and focusing on two different spectrums of time. The first one being weeks 8 through 14, which is the remainder of the fantasy football regular season, and of course, weeks 15 through 17, the fantasy football playoffs. Of course, the entire goal is for the remainder of the regular season to earn a spot to play in the fantasy football playoffs. But if in fact you're already on a great pace to achieve that, you can go ahead and prepare by picking up some players that have incredible matchups for the final 3 weeks, which is only going to help bring home a 2022 fantasy football championship. So over the course of today's episode, we'll talk about a couple players that have extremely favorable matchups going into the future. Now, as I go into more details regarding those players, I do want to preface that this entire video is to set up what we're producing tomorrow, which is a rest of season rankings video for all four primary positions: running back, wide receiver, quarterback, and tight end. You guys know how much of an impact I believe matchups play on a weekly basis, and you guys see that firsthand on a weekly basis as I continue to try to enforce the idea of playing running backs against Detroit, Houston, Cleveland, the Los Angeles Chargers, all these teams that really cannot stop the run, etc. So, of course, we'll talk about the overall strength of schedule for the rest of the season here, and it'll obviously be implemented into the rest of season rankings for tomorrow's episode as we talk about the top 36 running backs, wide receivers, top 16 quarterbacks, and tight ends. Either way, before we begin and get into our rest of season strength of schedule video, I want to remind you guys, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season for the singular purpose of not only winning your weekly matchups, but helping you capture a 2022 fantasy football championship. Also, if you guys haven't checked out PrizePicks and want to continue to play fantasy on a daily basis, you can go ahead and check them out. There's a link down in the description. Even if you don't have anybody participating in tonight's game between the Baltimore Ravens and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, you can go ahead, put together some entries, picking more or less on a given player statistic. Have some fun there. Also, you can go ahead and participate in games, whether it's the NBA, the MLB, NHL. So for those of you interested, travel to their website. When you decide to make a first-time deposit, be sure to use promo code Andrew, because when you use the promo code, you'll be given a first deposit match up to $100. So if you deposit 20, they'll give you 20. If you deposit 50, they'll give you 50, all the way up to 100. So for those of you interested, check that out. Link in the description. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about the rest of season strength of schedule, specifically at the position that we all know is quite frankly the most important right now, the running back position. As you can see immediately to the right of me, I've gone ahead and found the strength of schedule average based on how many points defenses have given up to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in terms of rushing statistics alone. Now, like I show you guys every single Tuesday before the running back rankings video, I kind of give you guys a little bit of a sneak peek as to how well defenses have been playing against opposing running backs. But if you go ahead and you take how many points per game they give up to opposing running backs on average thus far and expand that across the rest of the season, we find the following averages, leading to the Miami Dolphins having the easiest strength of schedule at the running back position. Now, if you guys remember the last strength of schedule video update we did, Miami Dolphins were at the top of that list. If you guys remember the preseason strength of schedule video, the Miami Dolphins were at that list. Every single calculation I do in regards to strength of schedule is poignantly accurate, just so we can make sure that we are on the right path of acquiring players on our roster that are going to have favorable matchups, so that we don't have to worry about that singular variable bugging us on a weekly basis, and of course hoping that is going to lead to our ultimate success. So let's go ahead and let's start talking about a couple players that I wanted to kind of pick out. Not big name players, because when you look at the New York Giants having the second easiest strength of schedule at the running back position for the remainder of the regular season, of course we're expecting Saquon Barkley to be a stud. But let's talk about some of these other teams that surround the New York Giants there, specifically the Miami Dolphins at number 1. Raheem Mostert, as of right now, from my perspective, looks like the James Conner of this year. And it is a coincidence considering he has Chase Edmonds in his backfield, and everyone anticipated Chase Edmonds to be the starter, similar to in 2021. And over the course of the last couple weeks, since week 4, we have seen Chase Edmonds completely lose his job to Raheem Mostert. In fact, the backfield touches between the two leans heavily in the direction of Raheem Mostert, who has had 71 touches in comparison to Chase Edmonds' 19 since week 4. Unbelievable numbers. And on top of that, if we go ahead and talk about snap counts offensively, Raheem Mostert is playing nearly 68% of the offensive snaps since week 4, while Chase Edmonds is playing about 28%. It's a pretty big difference there. Now, when we talk about the rest of season strength of schedule, as you can see, they play against Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Houston, San Francisco, and the LA Chargers. Based on how many points defenses have given up to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics alone, the Detroit Lions are the easiest matchup. Chicago's the 5th easiest. Cleveland's the 3rd easiest. Houston's the 2nd easiest. And the LA Chargers are the fourth easiest. So right there, We have 5 upcoming games out of the next six for Raheem Mostert that are top 5 matchups at the position. Unbelievable potential success here within an offense that is getting more and more comfortable with running the ball. I think Raheem Mostert may be a guy that could very easily win us a championship, or at least in some scenarios, if you're in desperate need to getting to the playoffs because you've started off slow due to injuries, he may be a guy that could turn your entire season around with one single trade. All right, another player I wanted to talk about on this list is Tony Pollard. The Dallas Cowboys sit at number 3 in terms of their rest of season strength of schedule average. And how I potentially look at this is if Ezekiel Elliott's current knee injury is going to be as bad as they've kind of talked about, I've heard a couple doctors speak on it. If in fact he's going to miss a couple weeks here, Tony Pollard could very easily close the gap and completely take over the starting role within this Dallas Cowboys backfield. I mean, just this last week in week 7, the first time this year we saw Tony Pollard outsnap Ezekiel Elliott. And if we're going to get into a situation where Tony Pollard is given a far greater workload and he gets to use his skill in the idea that he's averaging, 5.6 yards per carry thus far this season. He's averaging the second highest yards per carry after contact, only after DeAndre Swift, which is 4.34 yards per carry after contact. I think he's in a fantastic position to have a blow-up rest of the season. If Zeke's injury is going to hold him out for any sort of time, Tony Pollard to the moon. Like I was mentioning in terms of overall schedule, they play against Chicago, Green Bay, Minnesota, New York Giants, Indianapolis, and Houston. Overall, there's 4 matchups there that are within the top 8. And there's 5 matchups within the top 12 at the position. A lot of potential upside there for the running backs for the Dallas Cowboys, but specifically Tony Pollard, considering he's healthy and what Zeke is dealing with. Another player I wanted to mention is Cordero Patterson. Patterson sits on the thumbnail of today's video for a specific reason, because he's expected to return next week from the injured reserve. And when he does, by all means, he's going to have himself an incredible rest of the season. Hopefully he's fully healthy coming off the IR, because the last time we saw him, in the 4 games he participated in, he scored 3 rushing touchdowns. Not only that, he set a career high in rushing yards in week 1 against the New Orleans Saints defense, only to break that career high 2 weeks later and go for 141 rushing yards. We have seen this team give their running backs a boatload of opportunities. They've only passed the ball 150 times, and they've ran the ball with their running backs 181 times. They heavily prefer to run the ball within this offense, and I doubt Arthur Smith is stopping anytime soon, because regardless of the overall game script, they're running the ball with 2 different running backs upwards of 10 to 15 times per game. And with Cordero Patterson back, the preferred running back to lead this backfield, going up against Carolina, the LA Chargers, Carolina once again, those are, again, really good matchups. Chicago, right there. The next 4 games here that we're going to potentially see are extremely advantageous and a great way to get Cordero Patterson back into the lineup and some confidence under his belt for the remainder of the season. The final running back I wanted to mention is Devin Singletary. Of course, we see that the Buffalo Bills are at number 4 on this list. In terms of what they potentially can, put forth with Devin Singletary remains to be seen. But if you guys remember, late last season, Devin Singletary had a stretch of 6 games where he was averaging 18 fantasy points per game. The guy was absolutely dominating, and I think we could very easily get back to that. Since week 3, he's the number 20 overall running back in terms of fantasy points per game on average in a half PPR scoring format. He's put together some great performances, obviously on the ground, through the air. In fact, has been able to handle 74% of the rushing attempts since week 3, 77% of the backfield targets, and has gotten 67% of the running back fantasy points out of this backfield. Just a couple weeks ago, Zach Moss was a healthy scratch and was out of the rotation. If in fact there is no Zach Moss and it's going to be Devin Singletary's job, of course, I would like to probably have James Cook on roster just in case as a handcuff, but Devin Singletary could have very good upside for the remainder of the season, especially if we're in a position to go up against defenses that just really cannot stop the run. We know that the Bills will exploit that, and when they do, Devin Singletary can find a lot of success. Now, for those of you who are wondering on the bottom of this rest of regular season schedule, you're thinking, man, Andrew, Austin Eckler's in trouble, huh? Nope, he is absolutely not. You have to remember that the strength of schedule here has been calculated in terms of averages based on rushing statistics allowed to opposing running backs. So that's rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. That does not take into account receptions, because receptions are completely absent, because the data proves that matchups do not impact the overall potential for receptions and receiving statistics gained by a running back. So the running back currently, Austin Eckler, who is leading the league in terms of running back receptions and is on pace for the most receptions by a running back in a singular season, probably going to eclipse the number that we've seen Christian McCaffrey put up in 2019. Of course, we're expecting him to continue to find success regardless of what the rushing statistics hold in store for us in the coming future. Now let's go ahead and let's move on to the fantasy football playoffs at the running back position, weeks 15 through 17. Of course, there are a lot of great players here at the top of the list. Derrick Henry, of course, at the top is a notable one. We also have Alvin Kamara up there. We have Jonathan Taylor up there, which honestly, if you still have the ability to buy Jonathan Taylor low, I would be absolutely on that immediately. Travis Etienne is up there. But then we have a couple committee situations between the Jets, the Chiefs, the Carolina Panthers. And we don't know exactly by the time we get to week 15 who's going to be leading these backfields and who's going to be the primary guys and whether or not we're going to see a consistent level of opportunity to go to one singular back or spread amongst, the hot hand. As of right now, if I was to go ahead and just kind of give you guys a little bit of a direction, I'm definitely going after the Alvin Kamaras and Jonathan Taylors of the world, mainly because, the fact that they haven't scored touchdowns as of late only helps to decreasing their potential value and making the investment in their potential for success in the future that much easier in terms of making a trade for them. Now, outside of that, I think Khalil Herbert, the Chicago Bears, week 17, they take on the Detroit Lions. That could be a league-winning stash. You might want to just go ahead, put it on your bench. Khalil Herbert has been said that they're going to potentially get him more touches as the weeks go on. But in week 17 against Detroit, if they're blowing out that defense and he is running through, he could very easily be a league-winning running back when it's all said and done by the final week, assuming they continue to get him carries while David Montgomery stays active in that backfield. Either way, just giving you some perspective as to what the future holds. Obviously, we would have loved to see Breece Hall in this situation, taking on Detroit, Jacksonville, and Seattle. Christian McCaffrey taking on Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Tampa Bay. We would have loved to have seen these matchups. But unfortunately, that is not going to be the case for us. And we're just going to have to pick up whatever is left regarding the running back position at the top of this list. All right, I've talked about the running back position far too long. Let's go ahead and let's talk about wide receivers in terms of the rest of the regular season for the fantasy football year. We have weeks 18 through 14. As you can see, it looks very similar to just a couple weeks ago, guys. It really isn't that big of a difference as to what we've seen in comparison to the Chargers and the Broncos still maintaining at the top of this list. But the player that I specifically want to talk about is T. Higgins. I think there's still a very open window to go ahead and invest in T. Higgins. We all want a piece of this offense, especially where it's going. It's trending in the direction where they're throwing the ball early and often. And when they're doing that, it only opens up more and more opportunity for the wide receiver T. Higgins. Of course, Jamar Chase, Joe Burrow, Joe Mixon, those are going to be difficult prospects to invest in. Of course, we've seen Tyler Boyd have success as of late, but I still want to go ahead and make any bids I possibly can at getting T. Higgins on my roster. Let's not forget, in 13 out of the last 18 games that T. Higgins has played healthy for this team, he has put up 70 plus receiving yards in 13 of those 18 games. There is a lot of potential for success via T. Higgins. We saw it late last season where he was just as good as Jamar Chase down the stretch. And if in fact the touchdowns start to rack in and he doesn't get pushed out of bounds on the 1 yard line or tackled there short, we have ourselves 20-point weeks and you probably can't invest in him. But right now, it's definitely a play that I want to go after and want to make for the remainder of the season. I also want to talk about the Saints wide receivers. Considering they are choosing Andy Dalton over Jameis Winston, this is pretty promising for Chris Olave. Obviously Olave is going to succeed regardless of who's playing at quarterback and regardless of whether or not Michael Thomas or Jarvis Landry return, but I think it all helps. At this current moment in time with Andy Dalton, he's still averaging 14.07 fantasy points per game. And the remaining schedule here for the regular season consists of the Vegas Raiders, Baltimore Ravens, Pittsburgh Steelers, LA Rams, of course, San Francisco, and Tampa Bay. The next 4 games for them are all top 10 matchups at the wide receiver position in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers in a half PPR scoring format. That in itself is extremely promising for the potential of Chris Olave, not only continuing to establish himself as the number 1 option of this team, but to continue to build that rapport with Andy Dalton. So even when Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry return, it's going to be slow for them to connect and a far easier connection to throw the ball in the direction of one Chris Olave. Of course, we have some wide receivers on the other end of the spectrum, like CeeDee Lamb, going up against a very difficult strength of schedule, along with Amari Cooper. But we're going to talk about Amari Cooper in just a moment. Let's go ahead and transition to weeks 15 through 17, the fantasy football playoffs. As you can see near the top, we have the Cleveland Browns with the 3rd easiest strength of schedule as the season concludes. And like I was just mentioning, Amari Cooper has a lot of value in that span of time. When in fact we get there, weeks 15 through 17, and Deshaun Watson has pretty much been activated off the suspension and is, kind of knocked off all the dust, because I don't think he's built any rust over the last couple of years. I think it's just purely dust. He's just got to clear the cobwebs and start getting a connection with Amari Cooper. And once they set that up, going into the final 3 weeks, Amari Cooper could very easily be a league-winning wide receiver. Just talk about the wide receivers that have played with Deshaun Watson and the amount of success they have found from 2017 through 2020. Just talking about some of these players, let's talk about DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins in those couple seasons was unbelievable. In 2018 was the number 2 overall wide receiver. In 2019 was the number 5 overall wide receiver. He was averaging 16.28 fantasy points per game with Deshaun Watson. We move on to Will Fuller. In the 31 games that they played together, Will Fuller averaged 20.25 fantasy points per game. Can you imagine that? Will Fuller, I mean, I can't believe he's retired, but it is what it is. Throughout the year of 2020, from weeks 1 through 12, he was the number 5 overall ranked wide receiver with Deshaun Watson. Unbelievable statistics. And let's talk even about Brandon Cooks in 2020. Once, in fact, we saw Will Fuller kind of leave that organization because he was suspended. In the 11 games that we saw Brandon Cooks participate with Deshaun Watson, Brandon Cooks was averaging 15.7 half PPR fantasy points per game and was the number 6 overall wide receiver between weeks 5 through 17 of the 2020 year. There is a lot of potential for wide receivers with Deshaun Watson, especially considering they're going to have incredible matchups for the back end of the season. Of course, there are some other wide receivers you can go after, potentially Rashad Bateman, potentially other guys like CeeDee Lamb, who in the fantasy football playoffs, in comparison to what he had in the regular season, similar to Amari Cooper, is going to have a far easier stretch to help capture us a 2022 fantasy football championship, but it's just a matter of getting there. Outside of that, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Atlanta Falcons, of course, we continue to see the Saints and the Broncos in this conversation. Really, there aren't that many teams at the top tier of this list. Now, don't worry if, in fact, you have the services of Justin Jefferson. I know that they sit at the bottom of this list, but he's far too elite to have, Adoree Jackson, Stephon Gilmore, Rasul Douglas bother him on a weekly basis to where we're avoiding him in the fantasy football playoffs. We're expecting a lot of success from him, similar to what we saw, week 1 against Green Bay. I'm quite certain he could put up another great performance like that against Green Bay in week 17. All right, moving on. Let's talk about the tight end position. Weeks 8 through 14, the tight end position is extremely tricky because we know that touchdowns are the entire factor as to whether or not a tight end is going to be a valuable weekly prospect. But I do want to mention a couple players here for the remainder of the regular season that could end up getting us through it if, in fact, you're dealing with Darren Waller injuries, David Njoku injuries, something of that extent that, you really haven't been able to recover from, and or Kyle Pitts just completely just not being present on a weekly basis. First and foremost, the fact that we see that the Los Angeles Chargers maintain the easiest strength of schedule at the tight end position going forward is promising, mainly because we have Mike Williams most likely going to miss at least 4 weeks, and Keenan Allen at his older age, still dealing with that hamstring injury coming off of the bye week, could end up being a little bit slow to return. If Gerald Everett is going to maintain a number 1 receiving threat option within this offense, whether or not we do see Darnell Parham get a couple targets does not bother me. I expect to see Gerald Everett be a main part of this offense going forward, especially considering the advantageous matchups that he has coming forth. Again, not a bad option to go ahead, maybe see if you can snag him off somebody's team, or if he's a waiver option, pick him up. Otherwise, keep him on roster and keep him rolling. The other player I wanted to mention is the tight end for the Jacksonville Jaguars, Evan Ingram. Even though I thought that Doug Peterson would get more utilization out of his tight ends, obviously the amount of targets he sent in the direction of Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert was mainly based on talent rather than just wanting to use tight ends, because we have seen thus far this season, sure, he targets Evan Ingram, but not at a high capacity to where he's getting the touchdowns and the yardage needed to be a top tier tight end. That being said, right now, Evan Ingram has the 8th most targets amongst all tight ends. He has only 1 target inside the 10-yard line and has led to 0 touchdowns. Really has nothing to prove in terms of touchdown upside, which is only making him a potential PPR threat. Considering he takes on, after Denver, of course, he'll have Las Vegas, Kansas City, Baltimore, Detroit. That's the number 3, the number 5, the number 12, and the number 4 overall matchup at the tight end position. There is a lot of potential for Evan Ingram to kind of put it together here at the back end of the season. And if, in fact, they want to utilize him a little bit more in the red zone, could end up being a top 12 prospect at the tight end position rest of the way. All right, let's go ahead and let's transition and begin talking about the fantasy football playoffs. Again, a lot of the players in this conversation aren't players that we can trust, specifically Hunter Henry, Tyler Conklin, whatever the heck the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is going to look like, whether it's K. Dotton and or Cameron Brate when we get there. Of course, players like George Kittle, players like Travis Kelce, Pat Freiermuth. These are known prospects, known commodities that are going to continue to find success. But the rest of the way, there's just not a lot of tight end talent at the top of the list that are getting enough ample opportunity to justify us going after them in terms of a trade. And as of right now, the window for trading for George Kittle, that's come and gone. That was weeks ago when we were mentioning going after him. As of right now, we're in a position where, of course, if you have George Kittle, if you have Travis Kelce, you're in a far better position for the fantasy football playoffs. Consider yourselves lucky. If you have the potential to get Pat Freiermuth, again, it's a matter of whether or not they're going to utilize him at a greater capacity going forward. But what we've seen from him and Kenny Pickett so far is promising in the long run. All right, let's go ahead and move on, and let's finish off today's episode by talking about quarterbacks. Weeks 8 through 14, the only quarterbacks I purely want to mention that have potential upside based on matchups, which I believe could definitely impact their future for success. First and foremost, obviously, number one, the Los Angeles Chargers, Justin Herbert. Unfortunately, this may be a difficult ask, mainly because Mike Williams injury, Keenan Allen injury, and the fact that this offense looks terrible. If they don't improve anytime soon, I think Justin Herbert could be a trap to an extent, even though I think he's extremely talented. They just haven't looked like themselves. The offensive line's been beat up in some scenarios, and really, besides throwing the ball to Austin Eckler, there isn't a consistent enough option within this offense on a weekly basis to convince me that Justin Herbert is going to be able to turn it around and go back to being that 22 point per week fantasy stallion that he was. Now, in terms of other options, of course, Joe Burrow, he's on a hot streak. It's going to be difficult to potentially invest in him. But if in fact you have an opportunity to do so and someone's willing to give you Joe Burrow and it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg, maybe a time to go ahead and go after him, considering the Cincinnati Bengals' upcoming schedule is Cleveland, Carolina. Then they'll hit their bye at a perfect time to come back against Pittsburgh, Tennessee, two of the worst secondaries in the league in terms of giving up points to opposing wide receivers. And then you follow that up with Kansas City, which of course we know Cincinnati has their number. And then you close it out with another division rival game against Cleveland once again, whose secondary has struggled all season long. A lot of potential here. The last option I wanted to mention is, of course, Jalen Hurts for the remainder of the regular season. Jalen Hurts is in a position where, just like we saw in the beginning, when we talked about this in the preseason, for those of you who are a part of the Patreon and saw my rest of season strength of schedule, of course, Jalen Hurts was at the top of the list along with the Philadelphia Eagles wide receivers for the first 7 games. Now that we've passed that, Jalen Hurts continues to maintain a part of this conversation of being in one of the more advantageous matchups in terms of quarterback passing statistics alone. So this doesn't include any total potential rushing upside. The rushing upside is completely absent because not all quarterbacks run the ball, so why is that relevant? So when we talk about the potential of his throwing game, if those numbers continue to creep in the right direction, it's only going to help A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith going forward. All right, let's go ahead. Let's finalize with the fantasy playoffs at the quarterback position. A couple players at the top, very interesting. Davis Mills, Jimmy Garoppolo. Of course, we would have loved to have seen Trey Lance in that position. Of course, Russell Wilson, if he was a better quarterback or potentially improves in the coming weeks, this could be huge. But a couple names that I wanted to mention. Lamar Jackson. Of course, I know he hasn't played at the highest of his levels in the last couple weeks, but he's going to turn that around in the coming weeks here. He's going to find himself a stride, and when he does, in the fantasy playoffs, look at those defenses. Cleveland, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, good luck to those guys trying to stop LJ. The next player I, of course, wanted to mention, Deshaun Watson. Again, similar to the conversation we had about Amari Cooper, there's a 3-game stretch that once he's kind of knocked off all the dust, he could very easily get himself back into a groove and be the Deshaun Watson of old, which is a 25-point-per-game quarterback, a guy that really is unstoppable at the position. Either way, there are some conversations to be had in terms of quarterbacks at the bottom of this list. Of course, the Philadelphia Eagles quarterback, Jalen Hurts. Of course, when you're playing up against Dallas, Chicago, New Orleans, it's not easy, but this is passing statistics. We know that Jalen Hurts can run the ball for 80 yards and 2 touchdowns in a singular game and not even throw the ball once and still be a relevant top 12 fantasy quarterback by the end of the week. So we're not worried about him in any sort of capacity. Either way, all this information is to go ahead and set us up for tomorrow's video as we'll talk about our rest of season rankings for the running back, wide receiver, quarterback, and tight end positions for the rest of the 2022 year. Thank you everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's content, kind of getting a little bit of a glimpse as to what the strength of schedule averages for these offenses for the remainder of the year and how we can expect to potentially see them succeed and or fail in some scenarios. Obviously, we're not hoping for failure. We're hoping that these players that have more difficult schedules can turn it around. As I transition back to the running back conversation and we look at like the fantasy football playoffs here, even though, we have a team like the Cincinnati Bengals at the bottom of this list taking on Tampa Bay, New England, Buffalo, that's tough. But it doesn't mean that Joe Mixon's not going to have great weeks there. The Los Angeles Chargers at the bottom of this list taking on Tennessee, Indianapolis, LA Rams. Doesn't mean that Austin Eckler can't have pop-off games when it matters most. There's a lot of potential to be had. Either way, I want to thank you guys for watching. Tomorrow, be sure to check out our rest of season rankings video. Enjoy tonight's game. Be sure to check out Prize Picks. Again, if you go ahead and travel to their website, like I have on the right side of the screen, you can go ahead and put together some entries for tonight's Thursday Night Football game. Whether it is, passing yards between Tom Brady and Lamar Jackson, you can even go ahead, mess around with the rushing yards, receiving yards, receptions, field goals made with Ryan Suckup, kicking points, fantasy score in terms of a full PPR scoring format. Again, you can put together some entries. You can even put an entry in on picking more or less on a specific number of punts. They even have stats regarding how many punts these offenses have had in the last couple weeks, just putting it in perspective. Again, go ahead, travel to their website. The link is down in the description, and use promo code Andrew. When you do so, you'll be given a first deposit match up to $100. You can go ahead and make some entries tonight, win some potential money, and have some fun while doing so. Thank you everybody for watching, and until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.